If you have been hearing about a $2,000 tariff dividend and wondering whether it is real or just another headline, it is important to understand the specifics. The idea has been confirmed by the administration, but what is actually happening is far more detailed than most reports suggest. This is not a check that everyone automatically receives, and timing matters just as much as eligibility. Here, I will break down exactly who could qualify, what has been confirmed, and what you should realistically expect. If you rely on Social Security, supplemental security income, or Social Security disability insurance, there is a lot of confusion right now around this so-called $2,000 tariff dividend. Many headlines are skipping the most important details. Let us slow down and walk through what has actually been confirmed, what is still being discussed, who this could apply to, and what you should realistically expect so you are not misled or pushed into assumptions. I have reviewed public statements and official explanations, as well as the way programs like this are typically administered, so you do not have to chase rumors. Clarity matters more than speed, and most people only hear about changes after confusion has already spread. Now, let us start with what we know for sure. There has been renewed discussion from the administration about returning a portion of tariff revenue to Americans in the form of a dividend-style payment, commonly referenced as $2,000. That figure is being discussed publicly. But it is crucial to understand that this is not the same thing as a stimulus check that automatically goes out to everyone. It is not a payment that appears overnight without a process. Programs tied to tariff revenue work differently, and eligibility, timing, and prioritization depend on administrative review rather than a single announcement. What adds to the confusion is language suggesting that certain groups, including seniors on fixed incomes, could be considered earlier in the review process. That does not mean everyone qualifies, and it does not mean payments are guaranteed. It means the administration is discussing how to identify households that are more vulnerable to rising prices when evaluating distribution order. Until recently, most of the conversation around a tariff dividend focused on working households and middle-income earners impacted by higher costs on imported goods. Seniors were mentioned broadly, but not clearly defined. That is why many people are now asking whether something changed. The careful answer is that the discussion has evolved, but the mechanics remain administrative and conditional. When officials talk about prioritizing fixed-income households, they are referring to review criteria, not an automatic payout list. For people receiving Social Security, supplemental security income, or Social Security disability insurance, this matters because your income information is already documented in federal systems, which can make verification simpler if a program moves forward. But simpler verification is not the same thing as guaranteed eligibility. I want to be very clear here because this is where misinformation spreads quickly. There is no instruction to apply right now, no form to submit, and no fee to pay. Anyone contacting you claiming they can secure your spot or speed up a payment is not legitimate. Government benefit reviews do not work that way. If a dividend program tied to tariffs advances, eligibility would be assessed using existing records, and any communication would come through official channels, not unsolicited calls or messages. Now, let us talk about how a program like this would typically be structured because understanding the process helps cut through the noise. Tariff revenue is collected continuously and managed by the Treasury. If the administration directs a portion of that revenue to be returned to households, the Treasury establishes criteria to determine who is reviewed first and how payments are processed. Those criteria usually consider income levels, reliance on fixed benefits, and ease of verification. That is why seniors on Social Security are often discussed in these conversations, not because they are promised money, but because their income is predictable and already on file. Predictable income makes review easier, not automatic. This distinction matters. When people hear phrases like priority review or earlier consideration, they sometimes interpret that as approval. It is not. It simply means that if a program proceeds, those cases could be evaluated earlier in the queue. Now, who could potentially fall into that category? Generally speaking, households with lower annual income, those relying primarily on Social Security, supplemental security income, or Social Security disability insurance, and those without complex tax filings, are easier to review. That does not mean everyone under a certain income level qualifies. Thresholds, if set, would be defined officially, and until that happens, any specific dollar figure you see online is speculation. I know that is frustrating, especially when prices are high and budgets are tight. But clarity requires patience. It is also important to address another concern people keep asking about: whether a tariff dividend would affect monthly benefits. In programs discussed so far, dividend-style payments are typically treated as separate relief and not counted as earned income for Social Security benefit calculations. That means they would not reduce your monthly Social Security, supplemental security income, or Social Security disability insurance checks. However, this is always subject to the final program design, which is another reason not to assume outcomes before details are finalized. Now let us step back and look at why this conversation is happening at all. Inflation has raised costs across the board, and while cost of living adjustments have helped, many people on fixed incomes still feel behind. The administration has argued that tariff revenue should be returned to Americans rather than absorbed into general funds, and that argument is driving the idea of a dividend. Whether you agree with that approach or not, the key point is that discussions about distribution inevitably focus on households with less flexibility to absorb higher prices. That is why seniors keep coming up. But discussion is not distribution. Nothing changes in your bank account because of discussion alone. Over the coming weeks, if this program moves forward, what you would likely see first are clarifications from the Treasury about eligibility criteria, followed by guidance on how verification would occur. For most seniors, verification would rely on existing Social Security Administration and Internal Revenue Service data, not new paperwork. If anything is required from you, it would come as an official notice. Until then, the best thing you can do is make sure your records are accurate. Log into your My Social Security account and confirm your direct deposit information and address. If you file taxes, make sure your Internal Revenue Service information is current. These steps do not trigger payments, but they prevent delays if a program is implemented. I also want to address timing because this is another area where speculation runs ahead of facts. Even if a tariff dividend is approved administratively, payments would not all go out at once. Programs like this are typically phased. Earlier review does not always mean earlier payment, and processing still takes time. The Treasury must coordinate with Internal Revenue Service systems, verify identity, and schedule distributions. That is why anyone promising specific dates right now is guessing. The responsible approach is to wait for official timelines before planning around any potential payment. Now let us talk directly to viewers on Social Security, supplemental security income, and Social Security disability insurance. If you rely on these benefits, you are already in the system. That is an advantage in terms of verification, but it does not place you ahead of the law or the process. You do not need to call Social Security to ask about a tariff dividend. Call centers will not have information before official guidance is released, and unnecessary calls can slow service for people with urgent needs. Instead, monitor official updates and trusted explanations that focus on what is confirmed, not what is rumored. I know this topic is emotional because for many people, an extra $2,000 would make a real difference. It could help with medical bills, utilities, or catching up on essentials. Acknowledging that need is important, but so is avoiding false hope. The goal here is to keep you informed without creating expectations that may not be met. If the program advances, we will know because criteria will be published and timelines will be announced. Until then, nothing about your benefits has changed. You are not missing out, and you are not behind. This conversation is about potential policy direction, not a completed action. Now let us talk about what happens next and what you should realistically be watching for, because this is where a lot of people either get anxious or get misled. Over the coming days and weeks, if the administration decides to move forward with a tariff dividend program, the first thing you will see is not a payment, but guidance. The Treasury and Internal Revenue Service would clarify eligibility criteria, outline how households are evaluated, and explain how payments would be delivered. That guidance would come through official releases and updates on government websites, not through surprise messages or social media posts. If seniors on fixed incomes are included as an earlier review group, that inclusion would be explained in writing with income thresholds and definitions spelled out. Until that happens, any specific dollar amounts, dates, or priority rankings you see online are assumptions. It is also important to understand that review order and payment order are not always the same thing. Being reviewed earlier does not guarantee you will be paid earlier, and it does not guarantee approval. Review simply means your information is evaluated sooner because it is easier to verify. Payment still depends on meeting the final criteria. That distinction is subtle, but it matters a lot. Now, let us address one of the most common questions people have been asking. Do you need to do anything right now? For most people, the answer is no. There is no application open, no sign-up list, and no action required to express interest. Programs like this rely on existing federal data, primarily Internal Revenue Service and Social Security Administration records. If something is missing or outdated, you would be notified directly. That is why the only proactive step that makes sense right now is making sure your records are accurate. Check your My Social Security account to confirm your direct deposit information and mailing address. If you file taxes, ensure your most recent return reflects your current situation. These steps do not trigger payments, but they prevent avoidable delays if a program is implemented. Now, let us talk about eligibility in more practical terms, because vague language creates unnecessary stress. If eligibility is based on income, it will be based on documented income, not estimates or guesses. For seniors, that typically means Social Security benefits, supplemental security income, Social Security disability insurance, and any reported additional income. If eligibility considers reliance on fixed income, that is not a judgment. It is an administrative factor that reflects predictability. Fixed income is easier to verify than variable income. That is why it is often mentioned in policy discussions. It does not automatically put someone ahead of others, and it does not guarantee inclusion. It simply affects how cases are processed. Another concern people raise is whether receiving a tariff dividend would interfere with other benefits. Historically, dividend-style or relief payments tied to policy measures are not counted as earned income for Social Security benefit calculations. That means they do not reduce monthly Social Security, supplemental security income, or Social Security disability insurance payments. However, every program has its own rules, and final determinations depend on how the Treasury classifies the payment. This is another reason not to assume outcomes before official guidance is released. The responsible approach is to wait for clear confirmation rather than reacting to speculation. I also want to spend a moment on scams because whenever words like dividend, rebate, or check start circulating, scammers move quickly. They use convincing language and sometimes impersonate government agencies. Remember this clearly. Social Security, the Internal Revenue Service, and the Treasury will never ask you to pay a fee to receive a government payment. They will never threaten you with loss of benefits if you do not respond immediately. They will not ask for sensitive information through unsolicited calls or texts. Any message that creates urgency or fear should be treated as suspicious. If you are unsure, go directly to official websites or contact agencies using numbers you trust, not ones provided in messages. Now, let us zoom out for a moment and put this entire situation into perspective. The idea of returning tariff revenue to households has been discussed for some time, but translating that idea into a functioning program takes time. It requires administrative coordination, legal review, and careful definition of eligibility. That process does not happen overnight, and it does not move faster because of headlines. The reason seniors keep coming up in these conversations is not because of favoritism, but because rising prices affect fixed incomes more sharply, and because verifying fixed income is straightforward. That makes seniors a logical group to consider when designing a program. But consideration is not confirmation. Until criteria are finalized, no one is approved, and no one is excluded. If you are watching this and feeling overwhelmed, that is understandable. Financial uncertainty is stressful, especially when you rely on benefits that do not adjust quickly to changing costs. The goal of this explanation is not to raise expectations, but to replace confusion with clarity. Right now, nothing about your Social Security, supplemental security income, or Social Security disability insurance benefits has changed. There is no new payment scheduled, and there is nothing you have missed. What exists is a discussion about policy direction and potential relief mechanisms. If that discussion turns into action, it will be communicated clearly and publicly over the next few weeks. The smartest approach is to stay informed without obsessing over every headline. Focus on confirmed updates, not speculative ones. Pay attention to official announcements and be cautious of anyone presenting themselves as a shortcut or insider. If you see a claim that sounds too certain or too urgent, take a step back and verify it. Responsible reporting explains uncertainty rather than hiding it. Before we wrap up, I want to speak directly to seniors and fixed income viewers because you are at the center of this conversation. You are not being ignored, and you are not being quietly removed from consideration. Policy discussions that mention you are a reflection of economic reality, not political theater. Whether or not a tariff dividend ultimately reaches you, your benefits are stable, and your eligibility for Social Security programs is not at risk because of this discussion. Stability matters, and it is important not to let speculation disrupt your sense of security. So, here is the bottom line. There is ongoing discussion about returning tariff revenue to Americans through a dividend-style payment, often referenced as $2,000. This is not a stimulus check, not an automatic payout, and not something that has been finalized. Seniors on fixed incomes are being discussed as a group that could be reviewed earlier if a program proceeds, but that does not equal guaranteed eligibility or immediate payment. No action is required from you right now beyond keeping your records accurate and staying alert for official guidance. If and when this program moves forward, details will be released publicly and timelines will be announced. Until then, the best thing you can do is remain informed and cautious. If this explanation helped you understand what is really happening behind the headlines, ensure you are following reliable sources for updates. I will continue following this closely and breaking down confirmed information as it becomes available. Take care of yourself, stay grounded in facts,